The late 90s was pivotal for me professionally because that's when the Asian financial crisis erupted, challenged a great economics team that I was heading up to figure out what was going on, and it got me attracted to China. The West has always been skeptical of China. And so I had a different approach and stayed with it consistently until about a few years ago when I did turn more cautious, but we're getting ahead of the story.
Hello listeners, welcome to a new episode of Peking Hotel. I'm your host Leo. In today's episode, I speak with Stephen Roach, the former chief economist of Morgan Stanley, former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and currently a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, Yale University. I interviewed Professor Roach at his home last autumn, where we chatted about his personal development as an economist, from undergraduate economics student during the anti-Vietnam War protests to working at the Fed, forecasting and modeling America's GDP, and developing extensive ties with China after Asian financial crisis. He is a widely respected veteran expert on the Chinese economy, and after 30 years at Morgan Stanley, he joined Yale University and developed the popular course The Next China, improving the global knowledge on China through higher education and continued public engagement. I hope you enjoy this episode. So you studied economics for your undergrad at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and during your time there, the campus was the site of one of the most well-known anti-Vietnam War protests, which was violently put down by police officers. So could you talk about your experience in that?
I think it was the spring before my final semester at Madison. I think it was in the spring of 1967, where there was just a growing outcry about the draft and college students not wanting to get drafted and go to fight in Vietnam. So there was a large sit-in. I didn't know what a sit-in was, but there was a large sit-in at one of the university offices of students who were protesting the draft. And I was really curious as to what student protest was. And so I went to it. I don't think I joined the sit-in, but I was certainly looked at it from the outside. And then really it all broke out into the open the following semester, which was my final semester because I had taken so long to find a major. I took 4.5 years to graduate, so this was my bonus final semester. And it was October of 1967, on a day that became known really as a very famous day of protest for the anti-war movement called Dow Day, where Dow Chemical was coming to campus to interview students for jobs after college, and Dow Chemical was also making a product called napalm, which was used in bombing villages in Vietnam and inflicting horrific injury and death and burns on innocent villagers and civilians. So a group, I didn't know who it was, announced they were going to protest the presence of Dow Chemical and that they would meet to discuss their plans, that morning. So I was, again, curious, especially in light of what I'd seen in the preceding spring. I went to the meeting. And they said, we are going to block the interviewers from conducting these interviews. If you want to join us, we urge you to come and sit outside the room and block the students from going in. And I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. And maybe half the group said no, they didn't want to do it. They said, okay, you don't have to block the interview, you just stand along the outside and watch. And, I look back on that was a pretty devious plan, because what happened was the police came to remove the people who were sitting in, and it became immediately a pretty violent incident. And those of us that were standing on the outside as innocent observers or curious observers got swept into the melee that was going on. And so we clearly should have anticipated that, but didn't. And, one thing led to another, and the entire campus basically erupted. Thousands and thousands of students, tear gas, police dogs, and, it led to a candlelight march to the state capitol. The university itself was shut down for a few days. A lot of students were clubbed and beaten. I was not, but I think with several of my equally cowardly compatriot observers, we found a window to sort of dive out of to avoid getting beaten up by the cops, which in retrospect I didn't feel too proud about, but that's where I was. It led to me to begin questioning the wisdom of political leadership in this country, and sort of moving away from what up until then had sort of been blind acceptance of our system of government. Fast forward to just a few months, I had enrolled in grad school at NYU, and there were two more major demonstrations there. So it was a period of protest, and a period of sort of, for me, and again, beginning to think about the role of government in society, and the fact that it's appropriate to stand up and voice criticism if the criticism is something you believe in and is well-founded. And I have not had a history of participating in any form of political violence, but I think those were the seeds by which I have looked at, or I've dared to question government policies in dealing with economic issues or other social issues.
So what was it like to do a PhD at NYU then?
Well, I enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed it. But again, I was sort of like, it took me back a little bit to sort of the wandering around that I did in Madison trying to find my major. I made it through, the courses. I did well. I made it through, the written exams, which were very challenging. And then you have to go through these oral exams, which are really frightening. But I cleared all that. I did okay. But then it came time to write a doctoral dissertation, and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to write on. So I worked for maybe, a half a year, 9 months, thinking I wanted to do something in economic development. And I worked with this young development economist, and it didn't work. And so another professor a young professor had just been recruited from Columbia, who had joined. He was born in Afghanistan. His name was
Nadiri, Nadiri,
Ishak, but everybody called him Ned. And he was building, really interesting models. And I think I took a course from him. And I told him where I was, and he was interested in working with me, and he gave me some suggestions as to where I might look to apply some models that he was working on that were really sort of cutting edge models, but applying them to a different area, and that's where I ended up what I ended up doing. And with his encouragement, I took my proposal for the doctoral dissertation and turned it into an application for a dissertation fellowship at the Brookings Institution. It was a highly competitive competition where, they'd get a lot of applications from econ grad students to write their PhD theses, spend a year in residence at Brookings. And I was selected. And so I went down there to DC and, got a little study Carol and worked hard and I stayed in touch with my advisor at NYU, but I also had an advisor now at Brookings, and spent a year doing the research and writing a dissertation.
What was the dissertation about?
It was a model of the U.S. labor market, but it was following the modeling of my advisor. I developed a system of equations that linked the labor market to other markets and used some seemingly sophisticated econometric tools to identify the linkages between markets. To be honest with you, I look back on my dissertation. I learned a lot writing it, but the final product was terrible. Of all the things I've written over the years, it's probably the thing I'm probably least proud of. But, I poured my heart into it and completed it, defended it. And I remember I'd already started working at the Federal Reserve, so I'd been working there for a few months and took the train up to do the defense. And before I went back, Oscar Morgenstern, the esteemed game theorist, at that point fairly old, Austrian, said, do you have a second? I would love to just chat with you in my office. So I said, sure, here's this world-renowned famous economist who was on my committee, and he says, sit down, and he takes out an old bottle of sherry and these two little cut glass goblets. And he pours me a glass of sherry and pours one to himself, and he raises the glass and he says, congratulations, I want to drink a toast to the newest doctorate of economics, in our profession. And I was, really feeling terrific that this esteemed guy wanted to take the time to do this. And then he said, I just have one question. He said, what's the gross national product of the United States? That was before we called it GDP. It was then gross national product. I said, well, it's a sum of goods and services produced, in the United States. He says, no, what's the number? And I go, I don't know, it's a few billion, many billions of dollars. He says, okay, what's the consumer price index? So he went down the list of like, I don't know, 5 or 6 well-known economic concepts, all of which I knew the definitions of, but none of which I knew the actual numbers for. He said, okay. And at that point, I think at some point during this interrogation, I asked him for more sherry. And he was happy to give it to me. But he said, okay, he said, you've completed your coursework, you've completed your dissertation, you have great knowledge of all the tools of modern economics, but you're now working for the Federal Reserve, and now you need to learn how to be an economist. I've never forgotten that. And, that was another one of those sort of, I won't say pivotal, but a focusing aspect of my life of trying to use economic tools to really understand and deepen my knowledge and knowledge of my clients, whatever, on real substantive economic issues, rather than going off and doing theory, abstract theory.
Did you want to work at Wall Street after your PhD? Was it an option?
No, I didn't. I did not want to do that. I had no interest in doing that. Yeah. Wall Street finance, those were the fat cat enemies that, I had no desire of associating with. And I just dug in and went to work at the Fed, and I loved it. I really did.
What did you do at the Fed? I mean, how did you do the forecasting? Or which part of the forecasting did you contribute to?
Well, I contributed, again, initially to capital spending. So what I did, because the existing forecast was pretty primitive and obsolete, there were like 4 or 5 leading models of investment theory that were sort of state-of-the-art assessments of capital spending. And rather than utilize one model to provide the input, I built a system that was able to sort of produce 4 to 5 alternative answers to the capital spending forecast based on 4 to 5 leading models. And I had the skill set to be able to do that. And I presented the forecast as a range defined by these models, and had the insights to be able to argue which of the parameters or which of the models was most relevant in the current environment. And the research director, who went on to be a member of the Federal Reserve Board, was taken with my approach and gave me very positive feedback on it. What happened was my performance was good. I was getting great feedback on the work I was doing, and I'd been there for about maybe 3 years, and the research director wanted to see me and a colleague, and asked if we would come to his office. And we didn't know what was going on. But it turns out that the overall forecast of the U.S. economy, it was pulled together mechanically every month by this old-timer at the Fed named Court Perret, P-E-R-E-T, and he had an old-fashioned Monroe calculator on his desk. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a giant machine where he would just constantly sit and type numbers in. And somehow he produced a full-blown forecast of the U.S. economy based on the input from the sector analysts like me and others. And it was a horribly obsolete and primitive way to do it. And so the research director asked me and another colleague to create a different approach, do it on a computer. He didn't care how we did it, but give us the capacity to do multiple iterations of the forecast rather than doing it once a month. And so this guy, Court Perret, went on vacation one summer, maybe that summer, for 2 weeks. And he said, by the time he comes back, you guys have this done. So we had 2 weeks to do it. And we did it.
To defenestrate him.
We had, yeah, exactly. So we figured out what we wanted to do and how to do it. And the other guy's name was Larry Sliffman, and we split it up. And we created a model, a forecasting tool for the whole economy that to some extent is still in place today.
Mm. Did you enjoy working at the Fed?
I loved it. I almost didn't want to leave. I mean, I was approached by a headhunter maybe in my 5th or 6th year to go to a place called Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, which is the predecessor of J.P. Morgan. You know, I really was torn as to whether or not I wanted to go. Because I love the Fed, I love the people, I love the structure, I love the position I was in, I love the work I was doing, and yet I realized the opportunities in terms of financial rewards for me and my soon-to-be family were limited. So I made the decision to take that job at Morgan Guaranty, and I hated it. It was a terrible job. The function of the economics group in that wholesale bank was not satisfying to me. I found some places where it was. I worked there, and then I lasted 3 years and went to Morgan Stanley and stayed there for 30.
Why did Morgan Stanley want a team of economic researchers?
Well, Wall Street's a very competitive place. And a lot of firms they could all do trades the same way. They could all do banking and underwriting the same way. But research it enabled firms to differentiate. So, if you had a provocative call on the economy that was different than the competitors and was right and was different for reasons that made clients think about their companies, their investments, their strategy, you'd get more business.
Were there big contrarian calls that you made that were different from others?
Yeah. Yeah, I was, a contrarian a lot of times, which separated me from the competition. So I'd make contrary calls on business cycles and their implications for Fed policy and interest rates. But I'd also make a lot of contrary thematic calls that would create, some controversy and get a lot of attention in the media that the clients would find really important to wrap their arms around. And China was one of them. Yeah. That's, clearly a big call that I made. But there were other calls before I discovered China on corporate debt, corporate restructuring, the role of productivity, Japan. Yeah.
And what were some of the right calls and the wrong calls, looking back?
Well, I think, there were some interest rate calls I made, right? Interest rate, and because of my experience at the Fed, I always became concerned that inflation was coming back. It finally did come back a few years ago, but that was after a lot of water had gone under the bridge. But, I let my concerns about inflation taint my views on Fed policy and interest rates. So I was, for a long time, on the wrong side of, a secular decline in U.S. interest rates. I kept looking for interest rates to go back up, and they didn't. I had a lot of wounds associated with that. I also had a very early call on a renaissance of U.S. productivity that ended up happening, but I changed my optimistic view on productivity largely for the reason that I felt that there was too much productivity that's being driven by hollowing out cost cutting, firing people, closing plants, rather than by creative and thoughtful applications of new technologies. And so that became a very controversial call that I made in the, in the 90s. Caused a lot of, got a lot of media attention around the world, where I argued that sustainable productivity growth needed to draw on powerful new technologies rather than on firing workers and closing plants. And I went further in arguing that there would be a backlash by American workers if the productivity was largely due to the pressures that companies were placing on job security and their real wages. So I developed this thesis called worker backlash, that the workers would arise, stand up to the excesses of corporate power. And there was one CEO, this gentleman by the name of Al Dunlop, who I don't think is alive anymore, but who eventually sort of became the poster child for the excesses of corporate power squeezing workers.
Okay.
And I think I criticized him. He was known as Chainsaw Al Dunlap. And I was critical of him on a television program. It turns out he was a client of Morgan Stanley, and he flew to Morgan Stanley and demanded to see the CEO and have me fired on the spot for having the audacity to be critical of him, and the CEO stood by me and defended me. So anyway, that was a provocative, thematic call that I made.
Did he pull his funding, his deposit from Morgan Stanley?
He may have pulled some business out of Morgan Stanley, before he went to jail, which he did.
After a few years at Morgan Stanley, you became the chief economist. What was it like being in charge of the MS research team?
It was in 1995. And there was this thing called email and the internet that was sort of becoming an important tool of the business. And I would commute by Metro North train, and I would sometimes talk with my colleagues in the train about different aspects of the business. And there was this one guy that I would talk to. He was sort of interested in technology. I'm not sure what his job was. But he said, you should think about ways that you can communicate with your team members on a regular basis. And that whetted my appetite for creating a group email platform where I would be able to communicate with the whole team on a real-time basis. And out of that idea came this thought that I had that wouldn't it be great if everybody were to write something very briefly every day about their economy, a market, a policy development, data, whatever was interested, and that we would assemble that information just for internal purposes to know what's going on in the world every day. So when I got up in the morning, I would have a note from my Japan guy, my China guy, my Hong Kong guy, my Germany guy, whatever.
That's almost like an internal Financial Times.
Yeah. Well, but these were just, a few words. So we did that. And I asked the whole team, I said, look, I'm not here to give you all orders. You've all got your own stuff to do, but you're part of my team. And I would like you to do this every day, 5 days a week. And I think I said, I would like you to do it. I think my initial request was like 150 to 200 words a day. I said, I don't think it's too much. You guys have valuable chairs, but I want to know what's going on in your part of the world every day, each day, 5 days a week. And Morgan Stanley is such an entrepreneurial place that there were members of the sales force that got a hold of this daily thing. And they started sending it out to their clients, and the clients loved it. And so I knew I had gotten onto something really big. And so I thought about it, and I went back to my buddy on the train who was close to the CEO, or maybe he was the president of the firm then. And I said, I want to create a product we would call the Global Economic Forum. And we would put this out daily. It would be, we'd need some help in terms of formatting and getting it through, I think compliance was pretty primitive at that point. But we would use this to create a product that, it could be a Wall Street version of the Financial Times. There was no economic blog. There was no internet-based research products that existed back then, but we did it.
This would be an email newsletter, wouldn't it? Or
well, it would start out as an email, but then we'd put it out on something called, that Morgan Stanley had never heard of, a website. I remember I made the pitch to the senior management of Morgan Stanley when I needed support. I said, look, last night while you were sleeping, the following 5 things happened. The Mexican peso was devalued. There was a debt default in Argentina. I'm making this stuff up, and consumer sentiment collapsed in Brazil. None of this was in the newspaper today, but here's what your team said about it that you could have read when you came to work in the morning. And I slapped it on the table, and they all immediately jumped and said, yeah, we want this. We want you to do it. So that's what we did. We were able to get the technology to establish a web address. And I think the first web address that Morgan Stanley had was www.ms.com. And that turned out to be MS. When we did it, that was our address for a while, but MS was also Microsoft, and that was a client of Morgan Stanley, so they asked us to drop the name, and it's now www.morganstanley.com. I did this for a decade, 5 days a week, and I used it to bring the team together to look at the global financial crisis, the dot-com crisis, inflation, deflation. We would use this for thematic insights into what was making the world work. And there was no team that was working together effectively, organized around these types of insights and developments like ours. So I was very proud of that. It was exhausting, but I was proud of it.
What were some of the big moments in the 90s and 2000s for you?
The late 90s was pivotal for me professionally because that's when the Asian financial crisis erupted, challenged a great economics team that I was heading up to figure out what was going on, and it got me attracted to China. So I had a series of meetings in late 97 before I dared to reach any conclusion. And then I wrote an article for the Financial Times, published in the spring of 1998. I think it was called The Land of the Rising Dragon. Not my title, but theirs. And the basic argument was, don't paint Asia with the same brush. China is very different, and here's why. And I laid this out. The response for my clients in the West was, incredulous. They just accused me of being a Wall Street shill for Morgan Stanley's nascent Chinese business. This was just after I think we'd entered into a joint venture with a China construction bank to establish CICC. And just before we were getting some pretty juicy assignments to take state-owned enterprises public. So, my views were dismissed as being, classic Wall Street sell side. But I think, if anything, that just forced me to dig deeper, learn more, and write more. A couple of months later, and I don't remember exactly how this happened, but I got a message from, I think, the China team at the World Bank, telling me that they had read the article and had passed it along to then finance minister. He was coming to the United States, Washington, 2 stops, Washington and Seattle. Washington on official business, Seattle to visit Boeing. Would I have time to meet with him and discuss the article?
向怀成.
Yeah. Yeah, I said sure. I dropped everything and I flew to Seattle. I think I want to say I was somewhere in the southeastern United States visiting Morgan Stanley clients, but so I had to fly through to Chicago and then to Seattle, and we just hit it off. And and we hit it off in large part because we had a similar sense of humor and we're just pretty relaxed. So all the advice I had to give him was completely wrong. He sort of became my guide in laying out what he felt was the new China that the West never really, from his point of view, didn't understand. And I remember he told me a lot about this whole group of sort of dynamic, quasi-private, small companies called Township Village Enterprises, TVEs, and I knew nothing about that. And he said, well, you come back, and I'll make sure that, we'll set up a tour. And a few months later, I took him up on that. And I think I was going to Shanghai at that point. And he set up a tour, and I visited a few TVs. Anyway, I kept writing about it, and I kept probing and learning more about what was going on in China. And, the Asian financial crisis sort of came to an end, at the end of 98. China did not devalue its currency as the Western view had held it. I stayed pretty consistent with my point of view and sort of doubled down and argued that coming out of this crisis, China would emerge as the new leader of the Pan-Asian economy, replacing Japan, which was widely thought to recover, but for other reasons than I had, I felt that would not happen, and it didn't. So I sort of made a pivotal macro call on Asia that arose out of my early days of learning about China and my sort of long-standing study and understanding of Japan, and spoke of a new China-centric Asia. And, one thing led to another. I guess the next pivotal moment for me came, I think it was right around the year 2000, where Minister Xiang, he had introduced me to Zhu Rongji. Zhu Rongji was in the process of setting up what has now become sort of China's most important international conference, the China Development Forum. The first meeting of which I think was held in 2000, which I was unable to go to, but I went starting in 2001 to every one since then. So I've been 24 years in a row. I'm probably the longest serving foreign delegate to this conference. And at the 2001 conference, I was the keynote speaker at lunch, and I laid out a view for the global economy that was negative. I said, the global economy was going to be weak and bordering on global recession, and that China needed to prepare for that. And I was challenged at that speech afterwards in a Q&A sort of dialogue with another fairly well-known Western economist. Make a long story short, the China Development Forum always ended with a small audience, private audience with the premier. And the way that audience usually goes is the chairman of the China Development Forum is, a sort of a international CEO, and he gives a formal report. And John Bond was the chairman that year, the former chairman from HSBC, and he stood up in his, very elegant British attire and started to give this report. And Zhu Rongji just cut him off, said, "You can send it to me. I hear there was a debate between Roach and it was Bergson, Fred Bergson. I want to hear the debate." And I had sort of, this was in the Great Hall of the People, big chairs. I had settled in I think I had pretty bad jet lag. I was falling asleep, but I heard my name and somebody elbowed me and said he wants you to talk. So I gave a brief summary. Bergson gave his point of view. It turns out that I think my view was correct. And what the premier said to me as we were leaving that room, he came over, shook my hand, thanked me for coming in perfect English. He says, I hope you're wrong, but we're going to plan as if you're right. And I did turn out to be right. And the next year, he came up to me and thanked me for my advice. And I think he made some humorous comment about, you'll notice that Mr. Bergson has not been invited back or something like that. So those two officials, Finance Minister Xiong, Premier Zhu Rongji, they I think embrace is too strong a word, but they welcomed me as somebody from Wall Street who was able to articulate a different view about China than that which was circulating and had become conventional wisdom in the West. I mean, the West view has always been a view of doubt, suspicion, the books about the coming collapse of China and all of that. The West has always been skeptical of China. And so I had a different approach and stayed with it consistently until about a few years ago when I did turn more cautious.
You just mentioned Morgan Stanley set up a joint venture with China Construction Bank, creating China International Capital Corporation. Could you talk about that?
I hope I have the dates right, but I think the deal was established or signed right around 1995. And Morgan Stanley senior executives, my predecessor as Morgan Stanley Asia chairman Jack Wadsworth was critical in that from our side, and from the U.S. side. From the Chinese side, the key participants were Zhu Rongji and Wang Xishan. Zhou Xiaoshuan was also, I think, the governor of the China Construction Bank at the time, and he was closely involved in that transaction. It was a fascinating challenge. The idea of taking state-owned enterprises public sounds pretty straightforward. But to conduct a listing in international capital markets under the regulatory purview of U.S. or other authorities where the listing would take place was particularly challenging, because these SOEs in large part did not exist in the corporate form that was required of underwriting regulatory oversight. So our bankers were charged with the task of looking at these entities that were under the auspices of the state, that were focused on, telecom or energy or whatever, and going through the records of the companies, the warehouses of filing cabinets, to create companies on paper that would be consistent with those regulatory needs to conduct a successful listing. And that was a hugely demanding, labor-intensive job, but we were able to do that on several occasions.
And for CICC, as I understand, there's been a number of reporting about the collaboration between CICC, China Construction Bank, and Morgan Stanley, it seems to be a process where Morgan Stanley gradually lost control. The first few CEOs were appointed by Morgan Stanley, but later the firm was basically taken over by Zhu Yunlai and Fang Fenglei. Actually, Fang Fenglei first, and then Zhu Yunlai. And Morgan Stanley ended up selling the stakes in the end.
I think that's accurate, but to a point. It was more complex than that. I mean, we fully recognized in investing in a joint venture that there were a lot of short-term opportunities that would be hugely beneficial to Morgan Stanley and helping basically the government, the state council, the financial authorities create an investment banking function in a country where there was none. So we viewed that as an enormous opportunity.
Which it was.
And yet we knew that we were probably, if it was going to work out, the success would challenge the sustainability of that relationship, that the joint venture itself would become more autonomous, more independent, more willing to chart its own course, and it did. And so the strategic control that we exercised in the beginning was compromised by the success and the development of CICC from the inside. And so, that was a consideration as to why we ended up terminating that relationship and moving on to a new platform where we had complete control.
And you soon became chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, though you weren't specialized in Asia per se. Were you surprised to be offered that role?
Yes and no. I mean, at that point, I was spending a lot of time going back and forth in Asia. I was clearly the firm's senior research person, global chief economist, and had made a pretty good name for myself in focusing on Asia and China. And so I sort of sensed that the Morgan Stanley senior management might be looking to change the management structure of the Asia platform. I continue to write and speak on broad global economic issues with financial market implications, and in particular expressing my views on China. And I would put out something probably under my own name, indicating this does not represent the official view of Morgan Stanley Global Economics, but or the firm's management as a whole. I would write speeches, give papers, and do this several times a month. And that actually was a source of enormous sort of intellectual satisfaction and exhilaration for me, because I during that period, I was a real leader in driving sort of macro thought and the macro debate in Asia. I had access to almost any leader, prime minister that I wanted to. The card that said Chairman Morgan Stanley Asia associated with my name was a real entree into pretty rare circles in the policy and political debate in Asia. And I took advantage of that.
Now you're at Yale. Why did you leave Morgan Stanley?
I had a long career, and toward the end, when I was chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, a Yale professor who I'd known for years, Jeffrey Garten, was bringing a class of students through Asia, and he wanted me to speak to them as the chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia about, the Asian economy and Asian financial businesses. He told me that he was going to be setting up a new course at the Yale School of Management. He had been the dean of the School of Management, but had stepped down and returned to his former job as a professor, and wanted to know if I wanted to give a few lectures as part of this class. And I agreed to do it because I was going back and forth. I said I could do it, and I enjoyed doing that. And then I got a call from the president of Yale saying that they were going to set up a new Global Affairs Institute at Yale. If I was ever, at a point where I wanted to stop working at Morgan Stanley, they would want to offer me a job on the faculty of that.
Was this to be the Jackson Institute?
Yeah, it was the Jackson Institute, but at that point, the Jackson Institute had not opened up and hadn't hired anybody. And I thought about it, and I agreed to do that, but then continue in my capacity at Morgan Stanley and reduce my role from chairman to non-executive chairman of Morgan Stanley. And so I did both for about a year, and then I was reaching my 30th year anniversary at Morgan Stanley, and I decided I couldn't effectively do both at the same time, and it was a good time for me to stop. I wanted to be back with my family on a full-time basis, and I felt it was appropriate to end my relationship at Morgan Stanley on good terms 30 years later, and joined the Jackson Institute as their first senior fellow in 2012, I think. In my discussions with the president of Yale, Rick Levin, who I'd known for a number of years, we talked about what I might want to teach, and he said, well, it's up to you what you want to teach. This is a Global Affairs Institute, but you clearly know an awful lot about China, and you know an awful lot about the U.S. and global economy, and I would think that you would be interested in teaching about that. And that really was the light bulb that went off in my own mind, thinking about what I want, how I wanted to teach, and research and write about Yale. So I initially laid out a fairly detailed syllabus for an economics class on China that I called The Next China, to look back and draw inferences on the reforms and opening up, but to figure out what that meant for China's future.
And looking back over the past 2 decades of being bullish on China, has China turned out quite the next China that you thought it should?
No, it's been stymied, because to me, the next China, as I taught it at Yale year after year, would be a consumer-led China. I raised a lot of questions on whether or not China would be able to make it to the promised land. In particular, I pointed out under Xi Jinping that a consumer society, as we understand it in the West, is an aspirational value proposition, upward mobility, free and open communication. Eventually, a society that would want to express itself through elected representatives. And I certainly warned and worried about the aspirational aspects of a consumer society being compatible with what how Xi Jinping viewed the China dream through his ideological lens. I recognize that is an unresolved issue.
And what would it take for China to get its economic momentum back?
Look, yeah, I wrote about that 2 weeks ago in the Financial Times. I said that China's at risk of falling into a Japanese-like quagmire. Stagnation, deflation, and a growth trajectory that will fall short of what the party and its leader has laid out for 2049. And China is not Japan, but it's close enough to make the comparison a legitimate comparison. And Chinese policy needs to err on the side of avoiding a Japanese-like quagmire. And the lesson of Japan, Leo, is that you can't do monetary and fiscal without doing structural if you've got this Japanese-like problem. And the structural similarities between Japan and China are striking. Different systems, but both facing rapid aging and a shrinking working age population and very problematic prospects for productivity. When your workforce declines, the only way you can keep growing is to get more output out of the surviving workers through higher productivity. And Japan was unable to do that. And I worry about China being able to do that as well, especially with so much of the Chinese economy having shifted back into low productivity state-owned enterprises and the once dynamic and high productivity private sector being restricted. So China's got the wrong mix of economic activity, more state, less private, to offset the shrinkage of its workforce that is pretty much locked in place for the foreseeable future because of the one-child family planning policy.
And what factors or events were most critical in shifting your views on China?
A big development in the China debate was in May of 2016, there was an interview with a, quote, authoritative person. Did we talk about this?
I think so, on People's Daily or something.
Front page, published on the front page of the People's Daily.
Yeah.
So just to underscore that again, that this was a big event in senior circles, the Chinese policy structure. The authoritative person, always rumored to be a person very close to Xi Jinping, warned of a Japanese-like disease with asset bubbles and debt that could lead to stagnation and a, quote, L-shaped trajectory for China. And I made note of that and wrote about it and warned about it. A few years ago, I expressed my views much more openly that these risks were now in growing danger of coming to pass, and so I did mark down my prognosis for the Chinese economy on the basis of those concerns, and that's where I am today. So it was an evolutionary process, but the demographic issues have become more acute. The population has been declining more quickly than any of us expected. The productivity issues, for reasons I've alluded to, state-owned enterprises, lack of private sector dynamism, have become more acute. The unwillingness on the part of the government to really provide a meaningful stimulus to consumer demand has become more serious, and the property crisis has deepened. So, what John Maynard Keynes purportedly said when questioned I think about his shifting views on the British economy by the House of Commons are appropriate. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Quote unquote. And I think the China story has changed, and so I have become more cautious as a result. I am not in the China disaster, China crisis, China collapse camp, but I am subscribed to the view that the prognosis has darkened and needs to be addressed. And the urgency by which Beijing needs to address the growth challenge has grown. And I think the government is starting to understand that.
And it seems even that much critical thinking was too much for the Chinese government. When you attended the China Development Forum this year, you didn't get the chance to speak for the first time.
Yeah, I think the government has let it be known that criticism is not welcome. Xi Jinping has described this as saying, in his own words, that he only wants to hear the good stories of China. Well, good stories are great, but when it's the facts change, you need to sometimes hear some of the tougher stories. And the leadership of the China Development Forum, when I pushed them for what my speaking assignment would be, as someone who has attended every single one of the China Development Forums except the first one, from 2001 to 2023, when I asked them for my speaking assignment this year, as someone who has given keynote addresses, spoken on panels, and always had a role, they were silent. And they wouldn't really give me any clarity on that. Finally, I pushed them, the week before, and they said that we don't feel it is appropriate for you to speak this year. Your views are too sensitive, and they are likely to be sensationalized by the media, domestically, and the foreign media. And we think as it is in your best interest and our best interest, and I'm quoting them verbatim, that you do not speak. You can attend, but you can't speak. So I thought of, and they said, and you will have the opportunity to speak the day after the forum's over. There's something called a Boji Forum, still held at Dayutai, but it's a closed session, and you can speak at that. So I went knowing that I was not going to be able to speak. And I took the opportunity the day after at the Boji Forum to be very direct in telling them what I thought of that decision. And then on the way back, I wrote a piece that is now available on my Substack, which didn't exist at the time, but this motivated me to put out all my material on Substack, which I now do on a regular basis. The piece was called "What's the Point?"
I read that one.
And the message was, why did I go? And why should I ever go back? And the point is, show up and stay focused on trying to provide constructive feedback. Sometimes it may be criticism, sometimes it might be an encouragement, but engaging in debate is what you would hope that, quote, an old friend of China, which is what I've been described for decades, would be allowed to do. That's why I went, and that's why I will go again.
So this is all we have for today. Thank you for listening. And if you liked what you just heard, please subscribe to our channel on Substack and wherever you get your podcast. I look forward to talking to you next time.